Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Lane. Hey Lane.
Hello, you feel like watering some seedlings today?
That's kind of what I'm spending a lot of time doing these days. So it's a perfect time to let's talk about water and seedlings. So friends, I can't wait to dive in. Literally, did you hear the splash after I said dive in?
I heard it. Yeah, I heard it.
Before we dive into water and soil blocks, just a reminder that this podcast is made possible by thegardenersworkshop.com, which is where Lane and I call home. For our daily work, everything we do is rooted in over there, and you will find a fully stocked online garden shop, online library of courses available, tons of other resources. So, friends, we are just inviting you to drop in for a dip whenever the time arises, and you have a few minutes. But I'll warn you, once you go in, you may never come out. So, we thank you for your support of the Gardener's Workshop because we love doing this podcast. And Lane, let's dive in.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about some tips for watering soil blocks. Soil blocks are the way I start the vast majority of my seeds here at home. It's the way you start most of your seeds at the farm, Lisa. And a lot of people that listen to this also start in soil blocks, and there's always some confusion about how to water them because it is a little different than starting in plug trays.
Yeah, it's kind of like going from, here's a good example, going from roller skating to ice skating. You would think they'd be similar, but they are totally different, right? So I understand people's frustrations, and I can't wait to clear the air for some folks.
Yeah, so we'll just be talking about how to properly water your blocks, the best routine to get into, and then what to do if they're not obeying and they're staying wet for too long or drying out too quickly. So we'll cover all of that today.
Sounds great.
All right, so our first question is just going to be, how should I water my soil blocks? What equipment do you recommend, and how often should I water? So can you just walk through kind of the whole process, Lisa, for how to properly water soil blocks?
Sure, but first I want to invite our friends. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, you need to know that over on YouTube, there is an image up because Lane makes this amazing PowerPoint to go along. And there is the best image of me watering some baby marigolds. And it just really, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this one really fills that bill. So, how should I water your soil blocks? I like to use a watering can without a head on it, so it just pours out a gentle stream. And I tend to pour the gentle stream up against the side of the tray. Basically, you're not pouring the soil directly. You're not pouring the water directly onto the soil, which can really make your blocks kind of disintegrate. So we use a watering can. If you don't have a lot of soil blocks to water, those small watering cans are so good for this because they have what I call a gentle stream of water. I use a bigger watering can a lot of the time, and you really have to have good control over it to keep from over watering and messing up your soil blocks. So the equipment that you need is really a watering can that has that potential. And when you're first starting out, I think a smaller watering can, don't you think, Lane, is just
Yeah,
easier to learn?
I do. And the other thing I would say with a watering can is something about the shape of it. The ones that seem to work best if you're growing with trays on shelves is one where the spout is almost lower. It's not at such a high,
Right.
steep angle because it's really easy on the top shelf to water with whatever you want. But then when you get in those in between shelves, if you have to angle it a lot to pour the water out, you just start running into your grow lights and everything can just become a bit more difficult.
I agree. I mean, I'm thinking we could probably do a whole podcast on watering cans, couldn't we?
True. Yes.
But
Yes.
but it's true. That's like one of those little insider tips. So yeah, I totally, if you're struggling and you've only tried it with one type of watering can, that might be one of your tickets. And so how often should you water? My routine here is that that's the first job of the day. When I go out to the work building where my grow room is, I go straight into the grow room and do my watering chores. I do it first thing in the morning first because I don't want to get busy during the day and forget about it, but I want to give the blocks their drink and the maximum amount of time to be able to dry out during the daylight hours, right? So I do it first thing in the morning. And when I go to water, which you can almost see it in this image that you have, if you look at this, the soil blocks that are more underneath the light, I know how dark the soil gets when it's watered. You can tell that soil is dry, and you want your blocks to be dry and even a plug tray. And I think that's one of the um, features of soil blocks that why it makes it so successful. It is easier to dry out a little block overnight to be watered the next morning than it is a plug tray, which is a bigger mass of soil. It's in a container, which blocks oxygen. And I just think that's a real key point. So I water first thing in the morning, water them thoroughly. And then, as the day goes on, they're getting drier. Then they go into night and they are pretty dry. And by tomorrow morning, they're dry again. And I go through the whole process again.
And something else that I think is a good tip is to go across and water all your trays first. Allow it to fully absorb and saturate those blocks, and then go back and spot check if there's any that might need a little more water. And then if there's any that have remaining water, to make sure to dump that excess water out.
That's a great tip, Lane. And I'll tell you that I often get reached out from people that say, I have to water more than once a day. If you're having to water more than once a day, you are not thoroughly watering your blocks. You may think that they're watered, but the interior of the blocks, and particularly those blocks down the middle of the tray, are not getting the moisture that they need. And so, what you're speaking of, how I water and then I go back and put my eyeball on each tray. When I'm watering, particularly once the seedlings are kind of at the stage that you see them in right now on this slide, where their roots are starting to really develop, they take a lot more water. I tend to put a tad bit more water than I think it's going to take, so that when I do come back to put my eyeball on that tray, it's easy enough for me to tip the tray and pour off any remaining water that's in that tray. But I can rest assured that those blocks are completely watered all the way through the block.
One other tip that can be really helpful is also just making sure that you leave some extra space, sort of like a little channel on your trays where you can aim the spout of your watering can so that you don't risk disintegrating the blocks accidentally, destroying them.
That's what really helps me to be a speed waterer, by placing those blocks on the tray all to one side or the other. And I call it creating a well to water into. It allows me to go fast, which, I'm always tapping my toe. And so that's a great point too. Where you place the blocks on the tray can really play a part. You want water to be able to run around the individual clusters of blocks, but you also want to leave as big a space as you can to water into so you can just do it and move on.
Can you talk about why it's so important to allow the blocks to go through that wet to fairly dry cycle in 24 hours? What kind of problems does it help prevent?
Sure. Well, what is not obvious to us is that roots require as much oxygen as it does water. And when soil is moist all the time, there's not much oxygen. There's not room for oxygen to get into that soil, right? So you want to wet your soil blocks in the morning, and as they go through that drying out process, they are just really getting a lot of oxygen, and that's what really fuels that amazing root growth that actually happens inside the block. So allowing your blocks to have as much oxygen as it does water is a recipe for success.
Yeah, so the little seedlings are going to be healthier and happier. And then on top of it, another advantage of getting in the routine of watering once a day at the same time every day is that you're much less likely to forget to water your seedlings.
I am so structured in my business days that if some reason somebody comes that has an appointment here or somebody shows up that's not supposed to be here first thing in the morning and sidetracks me, I totally forget that I haven't watered because it's like I'm on autopilot. And I think structuring our time, it goes a long way in growing amazing seedlings.
Okay, now we're going to move on to our next question. So, what should I do if my blocks are still wet when I go to water them the next day? So, let's say you've watered them one morning, it's 24 hours later, and you go back to check on them, and they still look pretty moist. What should you do?
Sure. So the number one way to help them dry out quicker is to actually raise the air temperature. Usually, I mean, oftentimes we're starting seeds in not the heart of our home, where we're keeping it the most comfortable. Sometimes we stick them in a spare bedroom or out in a garage, which is all fine if you can control the air temperature in some fashion. So if the air temperature is cool, they're not gonna, not only are your plants not gonna be growing because vegetative growth requires warmth. In addition to that, the roots aren't going to grow and they aren't going to be drinking water. So that water's just sitting there. And that's just a breeding ground for all kinds of issues. But the first thing I would say, if you are experiencing they're just not drying out, first thing I would do is bump 5 degrees. Go big instead of this
Yeah.
little increment stuff. Bump it up however you have to do that. Sometimes people do that by opening or closing a door, opening drapes so the sun heats up the room, I've seen people with rolling stainless steel rolling racks in cool conditions, like in a basement or in a garage with plastic draped around it, like making kind of a tent like effect. There's all kinds of things you can do, but you have to be able to warm the soil up. By warming the air temperature up, that warms the soil, which encourages growth, which makes the plants drink more water, which makes them dry out quicker. It's like once you hit that temperature, everything starts to happen and it feeds each other. And one thing you will notice as the plants get larger, the image we're looking at is some stock that was just being born. And you can see there's a little bit of residual water in there. It just hasn't been dumped out yet. When seedlings are at this stage, they don't take nearly as much water as they do when that those plants are big enough where you can't even see the soil blocks anymore because the canopy is covering. They'll take so much more water. So heat is the number one way to fix that. And I do not mean by putting them on a seedling heat mat. It is air temperature.
And Lisa, what should someone do? So if a set of blocks still looks very moist when they go to check on it the next day, do they water or do they leave it?
Leave it. And I've had to do that. I mean, we just came through those really, really cold temperature times, and I had the heat a little warmer in my building because of, plumbing and all that with freezing pipes. I mean, we were going down into the teens, and um, so I was closing and opening the door to my grow room to warm it up in there more. And it actually got cooler in there because the heat, anyway, it's a long story, but the heat didn't get into that room. And I went in, and guess what? All of my blocks, they weren't wet like residue, but they were damp. I could tell looking at them. They were not dry out. So I just skipped water in that day. And I mentally made a note, you might want to check back in there before you go in this evening, to make sure that nobody is gasping for air, it being
Yes.
too dry. But I am all about skipping watering if in question, is what I do. When the blocks stay moist, too much, they aren't ever getting dry. That's when you start growing stuff other than your seed and seedling. That's when mold and algae grow. And what grows mold and algae? No, mold and algae does not, in my experience, affect your seedlings that I have seen. It's what grows mold and algae that affects your seedlings. It's the overwatering because it takes constant moisture to grow algae and mold. And so if you're growing that stuff, then you've got a watering issue. I mean, I get asked all the time, can I use this to get rid of the mold and the algae? It's like if you resolve your wet soil issue, that will dissipate. But I have certainly grown my own fair share of both of those when I've left water or got called away and never came back to dump trays or whatever. But when it happens to me, it typically happens today, but then it doesn't happen again because it was a hiccup. It wasn't that my seedlings are living in an environment where they're constantly wet. And that's what we see people experiencing. It's not about seed starting. It's about tending to your seedlings. And because that's the part that people really struggle with is just after you get them to sprout, there's a whole nother, weeks of getting them out to the garden that, there's just a lot of steps to implement and figure out. And once you figure it out, then you're good to go for the life of starting seeds. It works out really well.
Yeah, and I did also want to mention that back in episode 31, we talked specifically about growth on soil blocks, overwatering, and damping off. So if you want to hear more about that and some additional tips of how you might resolve your overly wet soil, you can go and check out episode 31. And Lisa, before we go on to the next question, could you just remind everyone of the ideal air temperatures that you like to have in your grow room for cool season hardy annuals and warm season tender annuals?
Sure. So, for cool season hardy annuals, 65 to 70-degree air temperature. And, as the room fills up with seedlings, I'd kind of bump it up closer to the 70, because I really need that vegetative growth. And then with warm season tender annuals, I mean, they love it hot, y'all. 75 to 90 degrees is what I am looking for. And it creates a real problem. Right now, I'm suffering from it. We have eucalyptus started, it grows in Australia, y'all. It's a hot weather plant, but
Yep.
it's in there hanging out with a bunch of cool season hardy annuals. You do all kinds of things to create more warmth, and they aren't growing, and they're slow growers. So it's like insult to injury, right? And so yeah, those temperatures are what the optimal is.
All right, now we're going to move on to our last question, which is I struggle with the germination of my surface-sown seeds when I allow my blocks to fully dry out between waterings. Any tips?
In my experience, we grow a lot of seeds that prefer to be surface sown. And that's because they primarily just really need a lot of oxygen to sprout. And they need not necessarily a constant moisture, but they need consistent moisture to really break dormancy and crack open. So, for instance, when I water in the morning, so we're looking at an image of some soil blocks that have the wide weave burlap, which is what I use in place of domes, pulled back, which is how I would water those seedlings, or not seedlings, the blocks actually, no seedlings yet. And I would water those blocks and I would make certain, just like I do on the other trays, that the blocks are 100% wet all the way through. And if it's a surface sown seed and I feel like, and I'm worried about that whole dry situation, I might even spritz the surface with a bottle. And I will tell you a little tip. I learned from an true certified organic lawn care professional that I did a conference with about 15 years ago. She said that their secret weapon to get grass seed to germinate was that they sprayed the lawns with compost tea. And you can do that. I don't know that I would use straight fertilizer, the Neptune's Harvest. If you do very diluted, but we have those compost tea bags now, so that's really an option. But misting the surface and then putting your burlap back down. And so they're going to stay moist for the greater part of the day. They're going to go through the night a little dry, perhaps, and the next morning you're watering them again. So it's that cycle that I have found to be successful.
Yeah, the misting is a great tip. And then also, like you mentioned, using something like wide weave burlap to help retain moisture at the soil surface during germination, that really makes a difference.
Yes, for sure.
And then making sure, as we always say, that the seeds are firmly seated in the soil and they're not just kind of resting on the surface. Or I know we've heard from people that they'll go to sow the seed and they realize that they thought they were placing seeds on the surface and they're actually still on their toothpick and not getting deposited because many surface sown seeds tend to be small.
Yeah, there's just so many tips, right? I mean, and I just want to encourage people, right? I mean, it's like y'all don't even know how many tens of thousands of seeds that I've killed. We were starting over 100,000 seedlings a year when we were in high production for all those years, not to mention all the ones before and since then. So we've had a lot of practice to figure this out, and that's what it takes to figure out your system, is to really, just keep doing it over and over and over again until you finally hit bingo. And then it will go. And I tell you, there's nothing wrong with domes and plastic, except for lazy farmers and gardeners like me that is only in my grow room once a day. I go in the morning and I'm telling y'all, I don't even think about my seedlings again until the next morning. When you're trapping moisture with plastic, you can over trap, which really encourages dampening off. And that's when I learned from Elliot Coleman all those years ago about seed starting and soil blocking. That was the reason that he didn't use it. It was just too easy to encourage diseases. If you monitor it, it's a whole different story. But the truth is that most of us don't.
Yeah.
So I've tried to create a little bit more of a foolproof, neglect system.
Any tips in general for someone who's just having issues, not even just with germination, not even just with surface sown seeds? They just feel like their blocks are drying out very quickly and they're needing to water multiple times a day.
I'm telling you, they're just not getting watered thoroughly. I mean, my grow room in the summertime, I mean, it's 90, 95 degrees in there. Our plants, they're warm season tender annuals. They're growing fast. They're big plants in those little teeny blocks. And we still do not have to water but once a day. It is thorough watering that is the real key to all of that. And once you grow in soil blocks and get mature plants ready to go out, and you realize all of a sudden one day, gosh, I'm putting a lot of water in there and it's disappearing. And let's just speak to that for a second. If you water and you've water in all your trays, and then you go back to the first tray to put your eyeball on the tray and there's no water there, then I think to myself, did I in fact put enough water? And then I always put a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then check all the rest of the trays, then come back and check them again. This takes seconds, y'all. And this is what ensures that you grow incredibly healthy seedlings.
I also wanted to mention that if you are having issues with your blocks drying out way too quickly, to consider if your soil mix could be part of the problem. Most traditional seed starting mixes, they're intended to be light and loose
Yeah.
and fluffy, and they may not retain moisture as well as some of the denser mixes that we typically prefer to use for soil blocks.
It's so funny because, this time of the year, I mean, I read often on social, oh, you don't have to use a special mix. I used XYZ, and that is so true. Of course, obviously, it's, use whatever mix you want. But there are reasons that I didn't make this up. People that went before me and before them. I mean, it's just that it's been a proven winner of growing and maintaining healthy seedlings, has been easier to maintain and have the best success rate. So yeah, Lane, I'm all for that too, because we do hear a lot of that. And it's like you can choose whichever way. And then another frequent flyer is that they are using whatever soil mix. That's not, I mean, the qualities of a regular seed starting mix for plug trays and blocking mix are opposites. Seed
Right.
starting mix is made to be light and fluffy so that air, that oxygen that we talked about that can be so important, can get into those containers where it's got walls around it and blocks the air, right? On the other hand, blocking mix is the complete opposite. It's dense because it is the container.
Right.
And there's just more of it. It's the same way if you think about big containers. I love container gardening. And I have learned many years ago from a very smart container gardening person, which is Jessica Walliser. She has a great book, the best container book I ever read. But she said in some talk she was given that you are better off to have one large container to have a large mass of soil so there's more resources for the plant roots than you are to have three small pots that equal that same big pot mass together. And it's the same thing in soil blocks. There's more resources in blocking mixed soil blocks for the roots than there is in those light and fluffy mixes. It may look like it works and it may work for you. Great. But if you're suffering, that could be it.
All right, well, that does it for this episode on tips for watering your soil blocks. If you have any additional questions, feel free to submit them using the form linked in the show notes, or you can always leave a comment over on YouTube if you'd like us to perhaps address them in a future episode. And thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Please make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. And thanks again for being here.
Yes, we're so glad you're here. Till we meet again. Ciao.
Bye.